It is good, but I don't absolutely freak out about it. It's really, really as perfect as you can get for an album like this, in my opinion.
Yeah, for me, it's like it's always just pretty good. Like if it's like I always tell you, I don't have it on vinyl. My daughter's got it on vinyl. She doesn't really listen to it much, but it's always just kind of good to put on. It's not a
Right.
bad one too. If I'm shuffling through it, like I kind of don't want to listen to music, but I want to have something on. Dookie's kind of a good one because I know the songs well enough, but it's unobjectable enough. Like I'm not gonna have like some deep, really emotional outburst maybe during like a long, drawn out part. But it's still fun. You can
Right.
sing along. It's good background music, but it's still good music in and of itself.
Okay. So I have famously not been a huge fan of this album over the years. I honestly don't know why. The music and the lyrics are right up my alley. His vocals are super hit or miss for me, though. Sometimes I just can't stand them. But this album is pretty great. In doing research for this episode, I got a little excited for their show later this year with Rancid. They'll be playing Dookie and American Idiot in their entirety, and I'll be filming both of those sets. Obviously, I'll be filming Rancids as well. But I want to talk about the production and the mix on Dookie for a little bit. Since starting this podcast with you, Rob, I am paying a lot more attention to that part of these albums, and I think that's really important to when I'm talking. Let's say we did this, let's say 3 months ago, right? When we were talking about landmark albums just in punk rock, and I listened to this for the songs and the performances, not necessarily the production. And those can be the same or linked together, but they can also be very different. And the song performances on this album are super tight, like really, really tight. The guitar tone's really great. The instruments are all able to be heard very clearly. But the drums, dude, I paid more attention to the drums this time around, and I put shit. He's good at drums, and they're basically kids when they did this album. So I just want to talk about the production for a minute and kind of go into. I don't know. I want to know your opinion and what are your thoughts on it. I never really listened to this album from that vantage point before, so it's pretty interesting to me.
Well, I mean, I think it's an amazing piece of production. The way they were able to kind of capture that Green Day sound, but make it so clean, but still not. It's a cleanly recorded album, but it's not a clean out. It's meant to it hits its intended tone. It's not like they put this rough band into a production, into like this high price production, and it spit out like this vanilla bubblegum pop. Although a lot of it is very poppy, but that was that was kind of the input. Like if you listen to
That
their
was
stuff,
like on purpose.
yeah, prior to this, they were always they were very poppy. It was their production that kind of lacked on those first couple of albums. You actually wonder if they would have had this level of production, would they have even, maybe popped a little bit sooner? I don't think so, because I think the songwriting did improve also just with age and that kind of stuff, but they're very, very close. And I think the production was great. I had written in my notes that I think like that guitar tone is just amazing. That's just like a baseline
really
punk rock guitar tone. Like what more could you want? And that's what I was really thinking about. Like, I was noting some like Ramones parallels and some other stuff, and like this is really like a standard. Like if you just want like what is really good pop punk, like you can start here and everything else can just kind of branch off of it. It is that good. And you talk about like the production. Like I love the bass on this is amazing. You hear it on every song. You're aware of it. Part of the way they track it, where it's slightly behind the beat, which is one of his styles, so you actually hear all of it. The guitar tone is great. The drums are very, very busy. It's a very drum heavy album. I think Green Day is a very drum heavy band, and they allow Trey Cool a lot of personality within these songs. And it was able to work too, because these songs are kind of a mix of really kind of classic punk rock with, I wouldn't say like arena rock, but like this sort of big epic kind of rock feel. Like they went way further with it with like American Idiot and some of those albums later, but you can see some of the longer songs or some of the jamming moments kind of in this. And I don't think that stuff would have worked as well if it was just slightly more lo-fi. Like it sort of had to have this level of production to it. Also, I think the production makes them snarl a little bit better. They actually sound like they have a little bit more edge with the production. Whenever I think the early stuff, it would almost risk sounding kind of indie, and I think it's like the production that gives it a little bit of that punk edge. Like I really think the difference between the Welcome to Paradise on this album versus the one on Kerplunk, I think it sounds more like a punk rock song to me than what they recorded in a punk rock environment, which just kind of blows my mind, but it's sort of the genius of this album, I think.
Yeah. I was smiling a second ago because you've already touched on like 3 or 4 different things that I had written down, which tells me that we're very much in sync with this conversation already. And I think we're going to have a really great talk. The production of this record is honestly, it's kind of bananas, dude. Like man, I hate to say this word because it's so like triggering, but it's almost perfect with just speaking specifically on the production.
Yeah.
Every single thing I can hear very clearly, and that's not always the case. There's a lot of albums. I don't want to say who it was, but a band that I really love. I don't want to say because I don't want to upset anybody, but it's because I know these people personally. But a band that I really love put out an EP recently, and the songwriting is exactly what I wanted. The length of the songs are exactly what I wanted. The topical like lyrics and stuff. I mean, everything about it, but the mix just isn't quite there. The vocals are a little bit muddy, and it's on a project that normally I would be able to hear what these dudes say and like very clearly. And with no disrespect meant, I was a little bit like, I don't know what the word, maybe like disappointed a little bit.
I was like, maybe like, yeah,
I was like really expecting high quality. When I got it, I was like, interesting, but it's still really, really good. But that can set an album apart because I can tell you that the album I'm referring to, I would much prefer listen to those songs over anything Green Day's ever written. But on a sonic level, this Green Day album is so enjoyable to listen to. And I've never really come at it from that angle before. I usually go, song is making me feel this way. And then I just kind of move on. But one of the things about doing a podcast where we talk about the same albums more than once is that I can give people examples of how you can change your mind. You can also notice things because over listens, dozens of listens of this album in the past 12 or 15 or 18 months or so. Past year, I've listened to this record more than I probably have in the last 20. So every time I listen to it, it's a different experience, depending on the mood you're in, all that stuff. But today I listened to it again on my stereo at a pretty high volume. And I was just like, damn, I don't remember it sounding this good. And part of that's going to be my equipment because I have better equipment now than I did when I was in my teens and 20s. But like that big of a difference, I just don't think I ever really listened to it from that angle before.
Yeah, I think it's always been noted for its production strengths. I don't think that's just modern technology. Yeah. And the production itself is kind of interesting because
I didn't notice it before because I didn't have good stereo. But now that I do, I'm hearing all these things that I did. I've never been a huge Green Day guy. I mean, they're good, but like so I didn't know that this is an album that was like praised because of the production. I didn't know that.
And there's a few elements to it. Is so on the very back end, you said about the mix. Well, the mixer was Jerry Finn. Now, Jerry Finn's the guy that went on to basically be the pop punk producer. Like he wasn't the producer here, but I believe he mixed Out Come the Wolves a year later. And then he's the producer that puts out Enema of the State. That's sort of the thing that really puts
where
him
I know him from
on the map. Is he was the producer, like he's the one that switched the guitars that Blink was using, like that Blink sound that became so huge. And he worked with everyone after that. He passed away actually in 2008. But all of the pop punk basically was produced by him. So the sound you hear, as that, and not really the Green Day same sound, but the late 90s, early 2000s sound. He's kind of the architect. He's the mix.
Interesting. Okay.
Now, Rob Cavallo, the guy who is the official producer, kind of says it was really a collaboration with the band. He's really the guy that gets the whole ball rolling for Green Day. He's an A&R guy and a producer at the record label. And he's the one guy that kind of got through to Green Day. Like he was a little bit closer in their age. He was relatable. They were really impressed because he could play any Beatles song that they wanted on the guitar. And he had produced the Muffs. So they kind of felt like he was an ally in there. He was very impressed though, coming into the studio with how for so young they were like the sharpest players he had played with. And they said what that came from is they were so used to being on the tight punk rock budgets, those first couple of albums, that they came to the studio. There was no time to waste. They were getting studio time in the middle of the night on a borrow thing. You know what I mean? So they had to be hyper efficient. So like they had all lived together for the first few years of the band. So they just rehearsed. So they were really like ready to go and knew, they were just kind of battle tested for a band that was still pretty young and only 2 albums in. They were being in punk rock, I think, made them much more ready for the majors. So sometimes like it's a culture shock to these people. And for Green Day, it was like they had already done the DIY thing. So this wasn't that hard for him. They kind of went in there with this approach, and then they refined it to be this thing. Like Basket Case and some of those songs, those are the songs that Rob Cavallo heard the demos of. So they had a lot of this skeleton in there. And then when they got together, one of the keys is they wanted it to sound a little more lively and sound like it was a little bit more of like a live band kind of thing. And I think this album kind of captures that sort of, that kind of feel to it. They didn't want it to sound, he thought the demo sounded flat when he heard the demos initially.
Okay. So my response to that would be I did actually know about them being super tight when they got into the studio due to the fact that they rehearsed and they come from, and I like that. I think that's something that a lot of punk bands probably benefit from, is just being on a tight budget in their younger days. So when they get the opportunity to go in somewhere, maybe that money can be spent elsewhere where it's a little more, I guess, better used would be the right word, I guess. But yeah, man, they were very young when this album was written and recorded. So it's a testament to their natural abilities as musicians. What this album has been able to do over the last 3 decades, but having the right people in the room is very important. Something I want to talk about as well is, okay, so I wrote down, based on songs like Pulling Teeth, Green Day were already doing the throwback pop stuff that Weezer would become known for doing, like, months and years later. This album came out 3 months or so before Weezer's Blue album. And not to like talk bad about Weezer, I actually, quite like that band. I just meant that it's wild that that particular sound was already being done by Green Day when Weezer came out and got very much popular for and well known for doing that sound. I don't know. It's not a big deal. It's not something that I want to necessarily spend a lot of time talking about, but I noticed it. And it's something that I've noticed in doing all this Green Day research as of late, that they did have that Beatles-esque sound in their music from the get-go. They did it. They had it all the way back in Kerplunk in 1039. They've had that sound in their music forever. And so they've always been kind of a, I don't know, dude, pop rock band with punk rock influences almost.
Yeah, and Billy Joel's never been shy about it. Like he he grew up on classic rock and then came up in the Gilman scene. So that's where he had plenty of both. And I laughed when you said that, because I have written my notes here on Pulling Teeth, more of a 70s pop song. Like literally,
it really
to
is.
the point that it's not just like 70s soft rock, but actually 70s pop, where there's almost like a breakdown where you could see like a real like a baritone singer kind of coming in there. And there was another song.
I was even thinking 60s, dude. I was thinking also, like 60s, almost like 60s Beach Boys pop with Beatles mixed in there.
Yeah, because there's almost like in that song too with Pulling Teeth, I would say it was not like Motown, but kind of, with the way it like stops, and then would you do like
there's a lot of that in there.
Yeah, and it's just a nice eclectic mix that's really kind of snuck into these, again, very dirty and grimy songs from a lyrical standpoint and from a lot of other places. For sure.
And I'm telling you, we're gonna touch on this subject a little bit more later, but yeah, I really do think that. I think when they were coming up, this was a hated thing. People did not like that they had these poppy undertones in their music. But it's like, well, how do you become a little more original band and a little more well known? It's you set yourself apart, and that's what they did. In a place where it was all super grimy punk and hardcore punk, they added this pop undertone, which is gonna be more. What's the word, man? It's gonna hit this. People's ears are going to respond to that in mass.
Yeah.
Thank you. More accessible sounds than, say, Filth or even Operation Ivy. Operation Ivy is huge, right? In the punk scene, but not compared to Green Day in the world.
No,
they're just not.
And like, there's a lot of people who are just big Green Day fans who don't even like really consider what punk is or care about it. They just like them as a pop band. Like they are truly a crossover in that they didn't just have their moment. Like those songs are huge songs that like your sister knows, your niece knows, your mom knows. You know what I mean? They're just they penetrated to that level. I think bigger than anyone else that comes from a punk scene and that stays in as close a proximity to a punk scene as they do. Like that. And here's where it all comes from. It all originates from Dookie.
My daughter, who is 9.5, was riding around my mother, who is 73, and a Green Day song came on in the car, and they both knew it. I mean, that's wild, dude. Like that's crazy to me. I just thought that I've heard. I don't know a lot of bands that I would compare to a band like Weezer, but over the past 12 months, listening to Green Day so much, I've noticed that they did that way before Weezer did it. Like, it's crazy to me that they had like the exact formula. They're just different people, so it sounds a little bit different. But it's the same formula, man. I could hear Weezer playing Pulling Teeth.
They're like they're almost like an emo version of Green Day, the way that Weezer,
right?
I was thinking that they're more off the emo branch, or to me, they have a little bit more in common. They're not grunge, but they feel like they're more out of that stew a little bit than they are pop punk. Although I know a lot of pop punk
I always consider
fans,
them an indie band.
Yeah,
like
I
think
think
a straight up indie band.
Yeah, I think they're more from that sort of college rock. So kind of stuff, and like the person that listens to that also listened to Green Day or whatever back in the day, but
also listened to Nirvana. I mean, that's just, the 90s is crazy, bro. Like,
and I think they all they're all kind of shades of each other, and like lyrically they are very aligned. Like these are just sort of the themes that people were singing about in the 90s for these type of bands.
I agree wholeheartedly. Weezer's a band that I think maybe we should consider covering a little more at some point, because I don't think I really like them. But I do too, and I don't think of them as like I don't have like an emotional attachment to them as one of our bands necessarily. Like I've had their albums, I like their albums. I just don't think of them. I don't, and not even like I've never thought about it in that way. But I just don't consider them. Like when I think of bands, I just don't. I think of them as 90s alternative. Although like when you categorize them, they're much closer to what we like than pretty much anything else. So it's kind of hard. Correct. I would agree with that. I was listening to I don't know, documentary of sorts earlier, and this guy made a point, and I barely heard it, so I don't know what else he said about it other than this statement I'm fixing to make, but I found it interesting and also accurate. I'd love to hear your response. But he said Billy Joe was okay with coming off like a loser and like stoner type of guy, but if you listen to their lyrics and you listen to like, I don't know, just the way the songs are composed and built, dude, they're like really smart, man. Like these guys are intelligent people, and I find it very ironic, but also good game planning, if you will, to be a really smart fella and then be okay with people looking at you like you're kind of the dummy. You know, it's like a power play. You know what I'm saying? And I never really thought about it, but they did put off an image and a projection of kind of like these slacker stoner types. But they're not, dude. These are really intelligent people. And
as we said, like with their work ethics, they're like known in the music industry, like the hardest workers that you will find. I think for me, it's not as jarring to me because I always find something very intelligent about punk, even when it's presented very like dumb. Like I'd like, to me, the art of punk is sort of the intelligence of it. And I think there's a big intelligence strain through it. Like I think the Ramones weren't like, I think they were actually kind of DUMB, as they would say. Like I think they were more unintentional with it, but since then I think that is part of the plan. But if you even look at just how they promoted this stuff and the reaction to it, like they were like kind of perfect in the way they went about it from a calculation standpoint, who they chose to keep in their inner circle. They never made the PR. Notice like they were really hurt with the way Gilman Street turned on him and all that, like legitimately hurt feelings, but they didn't go in the press and just bash that scene over and over again. They knew better. They were smarter than that. And then the lyrics on these songs are just pretty deep. Like there's a song, I think it was like She, I was thinking about earlier, which is not really like my favorite song on the album of all the hits. I would say it's probably like the least good one. But
that's like one of my favorites.
Oh, really? But I was thinking, that song works so well when you're sitting there with the lyrics, though, and you're like, God, that is such a good song. And there's a lot of metaphors in there. And I don't think these were like super, they weren't like super highly educated dudes. They were just really reflective kind of people that were really intelligent and introspective and could really relate to the world around them. That was sort of their gift, and they really reflect, like they really feel like the 90s, but not even in a dated kind of way. It's just like that's how people still feel like that. Those are still primal like instincts and urges that people have, but they really captured what it specifically felt like at that time. And it's a lot less like of a vibe than like Nirvana is, because like Nirvana maybe captures the early 90s, but it's all like, it's like too weird and too out there and that kind of stuff, where this is more what we like, I think, as punk rock, is that more direct kind of in your face sort of thing, sort of telling it like it is. Like there is sort of like a, sounds dramatic, but to this, or if it's Operation Ivy, or a lot of this stuff, kind of we say like a street poetry. This isn't exactly street poetry, but it's more introspective, and it's from that again that like sort of slacker Gen X sort of mindset. They're that band for those people, and by extension, because they're so big, just like the Beatles and the Doors are for generations after, they fit that mold, and it keeps replicating. Kids still like Green Day, like they're still very popular with young people, and I don't think that's by accident.
That is pretty wild.
They've never really turned into like that boomer band, like completely. Like some people will say it, but like you go to their shows, you go to their events, like there's young people. Young people are very much into Green Day as just a legendary. Like I guess it's like the equivalent of us going to see like the Eagles or something. You know, whenever we were younger, it's like
that's a wild comparison. Just, like, you know what I'm saying? I don't.
Well, I was trying to think of like who could have been around, you know, because like Hendrix and those guys were like dead and stuff. Like who is still around in original members? That's why they came up. But it's like it is of a legendary band from yesteryear that could still just sell out everything. And I think this music is timeless. It's not dated in the way that it doesn't. It's not like, oh, that doesn't relate to this world, or that like. Those songs are kind of basic in that way, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but they're very universal, very pop music in tone, because pop music appeals to a wide swath of people. So you could be like this street kid that's all like angry at the world, and there's songs in here that you can relate to, or you could just be like the guy whose girlfriend broke up with you in second period, and there's songs that you could relate to on this album, and they're not really at a conflict with each other.
Yeah, I think that punk rock has always been an intelligent genre of music. When you get past the like top layer, once you start peeling that onion back, you're like, oh yeah, there's anger on top, and then there's some, like, for lack of a better word, like some, you know, I don't know, dude, like whatever, man, whatever you want to call it, but like there's
social and cultural critique. It's pretty much all punk rock is after that anger. That's what you're doing. You're criticizing yourself or society, which is kind of a smart thing. You know, dumb people don't do that.
For every song about drinking beer and partying that I've heard in punk rock, I've heard probably 5 about some kind of social conflict, social, I don't know, injustice that needs to be fixed, or a beautiful love song that was written in like a poetic way, or a great story that was told. Like I've heard all this stuff from these same bands that are like rah, 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 drink, 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 fight, fight, fight. You also hear wonderful, beautiful music. I mean, I was listening to The Havoc, and I got some news for you on that band. I really love them. They're from Los Angeles. And I was thinking, like, doggone, man, like even though they're like a street punk band with the mohawks and the studs, if you listen to what these guys are saying, like they're like, A, I find them to be good dudes, and B, they're smart. And so I don't know. I've always thought of punk rock as that. But my last question,
very human though too. I think the point you're getting, punk rock is very human. Punk rock is it's not singing about Dungeons and Dragons necessarily like metal is.
Right.
So it's a very personal kind of music.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I just think that there's a level of like accessibility. I can't talk to metal bands on this channel like I can punk bands. I can get almost. I have faith that I can get almost anybody from the punk rock scene on this channel. I wouldn't have that same faith in metal. And so my last question on this little topic we're having would be this. So since we've established that it was kind of almost strategic for them to go into the stoner slacker imagery, yet be super smart and intelligent, how does that make you feel? I feel like some people would call that either being a poser or even a sellout. Personally, I don't think it matters to me. I think it's actually, I look at it as a net positive, but I can also see those people that are like super gatekeepery, or maybe just don't understand it, or they're snobbery, snobs, saying like, oh, that's poser stuff. Like, I don't know. I find that conversation will happen immediately upon a situation like this.
Yeah, I just don't think it applies to Green Day very specifically, because it's like it would apply. Like you're
interesting.
The way they're creating that scenario is almost like a Milli Vanilli thing. Like if these guys were these like corporate plants that came together and like created this punk rock, then I would say, yeah, that would be what that is, and they would be fake. I don't think there's anything inauthentic about those lyrics and stuff. I just think
that's a great point.
Like I think they felt all that way. And look, like their first tour created like 3 riots on that tour. Like they were a little too aggressive for the mainstream. It's not like we're setting that when we set that, we're setting that on more of a modern lens where we can see anything, and we don't realize that punk rock stuff was never even in the mainstream. So this is the first time the public's even interacting with this kind of stuff. So
I mean, punk rock was in the mainstream in the 70s a little bit, but I mean, not to just agree. Okay, I understand your point, and I agree with you. But my counter to that, be playing devil's advocate, and I don't necessarily know that I have a view on this that's concrete, but you said that there was nothing inauthentic about them doing what they did, but I would say, just by definition, exposing yourself to the world as these slackers and stoner types being kind of dumb, but then in turn you're actually really intelligent and you're really smart, really good at what you do. I think that there is a little bit of inauthentic, nature, not nature, but like inauthentic. What's the word? Inauthenticity. Good grief. Is that the right word?
Yeah.
My mouth is not working, dude. My back is on overdrive right now. It's making me not be able to talk very well.
Oh man, that's what does.
Yeah, that's driving me nuts. Anyways, I don't know that it's a big deal. I don't personally think that it is, but I will say that I think that argument would pop up. People would still say, "No, dude, these guys are posers." And you'd go, "Well, why?" Because first off, that word is look, dude. That word honestly applies quite a bit. So I can't say that word's stupid because I don't think it is. But it's overused, I would say, quite a bit.
It has a way more specific definition, in my opinion, than the way people use it.
Right. And my definition of it wouldn't apply to a band like Green Day necessarily, though I do think there is room for discussion there, because I feel like maybe they shouldn't have portrayed themselves like that, because that's not who they really are. But with their lyrical content and like who they were out in the world on a daily basis, clearly they were being themselves. So it's really kind of a muddy gray area that's probably not worth talking about outside of a podcast. But, it is a point that, as you're saying stuff, I'm thinking and I'm like, well, there is a counter to that. I would tend to lean more in favor of what you were saying, even though I was the one asking that question. But, some people are going to call them posers, even if they're the most punk rock of punk rock anything, because some people just hate stuff. Like they hate success, and it is what it is.
You can't ever, you can't ever say that they changed their sound to go mainstream. That's the one thing about them. They can never actually get that charge again. Even like we talked about the Offspring, and the Offspring didn't change their sound on Smash, but later on they made some of those radio hits that were clearly doing something, not to say they didn't fill those songs, but to sort of sell records. And maybe you could say Green Day did that a little bit later, but those whole albums are like that. Green Day just has a lot of musical like variants within their thing. I don't think they ever really just made a song just to sell, records. And that speaks to the broader point. They were always kind of filling it, whatever they did. So that's why they didn't sell out in that way. Even if you look at like the criticisms they took, it was for who they did business with, not really how they conducted themselves.
Yeah, I don't think that term would apply to Green Day, man. They've always kind of been very, I don't know what else to call it other than like Beatles influenced. Like they have this sound that is very pop, very, very like UK pop, like 70s UK
pop.
Pop.
He's talked about that. And there's even a song on here, and when I go through the song in my notes, that I put like, man, the chorus is like totally like an industrial British chorus that sort of very, very subtly. Again, this is the early 90s, so that stuff was huge, but it's not in the internet age, so you can kind of sneak it into other scenes where people might not have heard, like Oasis and that kind of stuff.
That band's really, really talented too, Oasis.
I just don't care for them, but they're huge.
I'm not going to act like I don't like their songs, but as people, I think that I would probably be much happier listening to and talking about. Right. So I got a couple more bullet points I want to talk about before we talk about specific songs, and then we'll move on to the next topic, next album. So unless you have something that you need to specifically talk about, I'm absolutely all ears. So I put one thing I've never really thought about is the effect that Nirvana may have had on Green Day. I've never been a big fan of Nirvana, but I understand their importance in rock history. Even to a certain degree, their importance in punk history. But even Green Day may have had some influence on Nirvana. Nevermind came out a little over 2 years before Dookie, and then In Utero came out in September of '93, like 3 or 4 months before Dookie came out. Yeah. So they were in full effect when Dookie dropped. And then Kurt dies on April 5th of '94, which was just 2 months after that album came out. The hard rock and punk rock world were shattered by his death. Nirvana was the closest thing the punk had to the closest thing to punk that corporate radio had back in the early 90s. And Longview was exactly what was needed to kind of get the rock and roll world over the tragedy of losing Kurt Cobain. And it was a sound that was the complete opposite of most grunge bands, because all that stuff is basically like dark, sad. I don't know. It's like arena rock, but like down-tuned, sad, and dirty. And I think that this was a perfect coincidence that song coming out that summer, Basket Case comes out, and then that shift is complete, man. That grunge was that bridge that got us. So hair metal was big in the 80s, and then grunge came out in the early 90s, mid 90s. Nirvana's exploding. Kurt Cobain passes away. Dookie's coming out, and there's that bridge that I think Nirvana, bridged the gap between grunge and punk rock almost. I don't know. It kept coming up in conversation, and I was like, man, that's crazy.
Well, so they're interrelated in a couple of ways in that what Nirvana did, like Nirvana didn't necessarily put punk rock on the radio, even though like they came up as a punk band themselves, but they had their own style that they had. Like they thought of themselves as being in a punk rock band. Like that was their sort of.
That's so crazy to me.
And it's funny, but it's again, it was a fusion of things. Like Kurt Cobain said, I wanted to make a Black Flag album with some Black Sabbath, like sounds on it, and that's kind of an accurate assessment there. But what they did is they made record companies believe in guitar music again. That is really what it is more than anything. It's that and it's not just them, like they're the spark because they knocked the hair metal off the charts. That is the thing. They knocked hair metal and all that off. So they completely changed, from what was going from that new wavy synth and that new wavy synthy stuff of the 80s. So then it's like, so they replaced that and alternative. And then like the bands that were left standing from the 80s, it's like them, Guns N' Roses, Metallica, Megadeth, all this other stuff. Pantera gets really big. So it's them and a lot of this other guitar rock right behind it, but they're the main catalyst and they're the focus of the fashion and all of that stuff. So then everyone just starts kind of getting signed. You know what I mean? Everyone is getting signed out of that. And so like the reason why major labels would have thought that this band that had a hit on Lookout Records could be like a major thing is because that template had been set by Green Day, but it hadn't really popped. Like the most successful kind of underground band at that point was probably Bad Religion on their Epitaph stuff, but they were a much older band and went way back. So they were still trying to sign people. And it's interesting because you talk about the grunge thing and there's a few things. So the other contender outside of Reprise Warner to sign them was actually Geffen, the label that had signed Nirvana. And they were really,
that's crazy.
And they were really seeing like a vision of like, hey, this can be another band on the pantheon of these 90s bands. And, Kurt's still alive at this point. And it was actually kind of a turnoff to Billy Joe because he realized like, wait a minute, we're not like Nirvana, but we're going to be categorized a lot like them. I'm always going to be second to Kurt. And so why don't I go somewhere where I can be more of a central focus? So that was one of the things that he sort of he kind of rebuffed, he rebuffed that. And another thing is this album is big for the videos and the traction that it caught on MTV. And there's an anecdote in the Sellout book by Dan Ozzie where one of the Green Day people, Rob Cavallo, or one of the promotion people said that MTV was specifically right before this having meetings that they needed more colorful videos because all of the grunge videos, all those 90s videos are these like black and white sort of drab scenes. And they were getting like a little bit of a younger audience that's kind of, not that similar to like the person that's into like the Nickelodeon and stuff and the more colorful stuff. And here is Green Day that is just kind of more that long view video is just shot in their literal apartment, shot, very much in color. And then the second video, is the one that's done specifically with the color rushed out. So it's like, it's flushed with color. And so that was one of the things that they did to contrast themselves. And again, there's that dark drab, everything's drab in the 90s. And then like Green Day is like fun. Green Day is like exciting. These songs are kind of dark and stuff, but it feels like more of a party than this sort of, this drab kind of thing. Cause you said like, the thing about grunge is, again, it's a genre that I think is very unconnected. Like Nirvana does not sound like Pearl Jam, but yet they're both part of considered part of the same genre. Well, it's because they're from the same city.
Well, look at grunge. You got Pearl Jam, you got Soundgarden, you got Alice in Chains. None of those bands sound
Alice in Chains like a kind of just a metal band that doesn't have fast songs, basically.
Yeah, they're a metal band that plays like ballads, but they're sad, happy ballads.
And I think of those bands, Nirvana was the one, and not to say like Eddie Vedder's on Bad Religion albums early on. Those guys were very much, they were all kind of into punk, but Nirvana was the band that had the most punkishness, I think, to it that popped through. So that genre got more branded as a punk infused genre because of them. But a lot of that stuff is really like you're saying, that's kind of that 70s rock, but just with with like distorted guitars and kind of recorded. It's more like Bad Company than it is like the Ramones. I think that's why I think Green Day shores up all that stuff. Green Day is like the perfect first pop punk band in that way. Like they're the perfect amalgamation of all this past of punk. Like I think Nirvana's more of a new sound. Not to say Green Day's unoriginal, but it's Green Day's more of bringing punk rock to the masses than what
Nirvana
really
thought about it like that.
Nirvana brought the Nirvana sound, which had a lot of punk influence in it, and an idea of alternative. And that's why I like to use the term alternative. I think actually better fits them because it was more counter to the mainstream just generally, which is a very punk ethos. Dookie's not really counter to the mainstream. It's more how can counterculture be in the mainstream and put it forward. So there's some nuanced difference. It's very interesting. I mean, those are probably two of the two most influential records maybe of the 90s in rock music. You could argue is Dookie and Nevermind. Like those are the two albums that set the whole decade up for pretty much everything else that spawned off it.
Right. Well, we've touched on the topic of the music videos before, but we've never really talked about anything else in reference to those types of things having similarities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you listen to the music, it's sonically almost completely different. But if you turn the volume to 0 and you just look at it aesthetically, you may have some differences in like background or setting, but look at the way Green Day looked and then look at Nirvana in the mid 90s and tell me they didn't look almost identical, which is, I think, one of the reasons why people would get Green Day and call them not punk or whatever, because they weren't wearing like studded vests and patches. They just kind of wore like cargo pants and flannels and t-shirts like everybody else did, because it was almost like amalgamation is a great word of like grunge, punk, skate culture, all that stuff was wearing that. It was all of it. Everybody was wearing that. And then like you had bands like Sublime bringing California culture into it, which is where you get like Pennywise, appearance, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, but I think that Green Day, they looked like a grunge or alternative band more than they did a punk band. And I think that would cause some people to be like, oh, well, they're this, without even necessarily knowing, hearing, or anything. They don't know them. They don't hear them. They just go, oh, poser, or oh, this or that. And it's pretty wild, man. It's interesting.
It's funny because and let's face it, what Green Day needed to do, what Billy Joel needed to do is just look himself. And that was the gimmick that he needed, because they were much more of that sort. In that way, they're kind of more almost like in that boy band mold. So to speak, instead of worrying about the snarl that they're going to produce or like the size of the mohawk and stuff, the way they're going to get your attention, because your girlfriend's going to be in the front row watching them do their thing. And they just sort of had that vibe to them. Like they talk about that too. Like they were one of the first bands that was not like a Riot Girl band that all the women still came to see at Gilman Street, like that were, just as a reliable draw. And it makes sense. Most of their songs are about kind of relationships and stuff like that.
Their lyrical content is,
they set them
very different.
They set themselves kind of apart versus like Isocracy or Crimshine or some of those bands that are playing around. Even like we think of Rancid's very like reflective and stuff and introspective, but Operation Ivy is and it isn't. Like you got a song called Shrubcore on, you know what I mean? You're kind of they're more like fun and adolescent, and like Green Day has the veneer of the fun adolescence, but they're very quickly like sensitive music too once you peel back that onion. So they're and again, they had a mass appeal, an appeal that you could understand doesn't necessarily always resonate with like the core demographic like us. Like you could see how some of that stuff would kind of just be on its face a turnoff,
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to talk about though, because like I do think that I think without Nirvana, Green Day might not have done what they did. And I never really put those bands even in the same room, honestly. In my head, I don't think of them as the same thing. But like, dude, that bridge had to be there. And
I wish Green Day got more credit though in that argument.
Really? You think they deserve more credit?
I do because I think I think they're just sort of like, people say, oh, that's the next thing that happened after the pieces fell apart. I don't think it gets credit for so much of like that it yielded from that to be like, I don't think it should just be the 90s, Nevermind happened and we have the grunge decade. Like, I just think that storyline needs to go for we have the first part of the decade is set by Nirvana. The second part is set by Green Day. I just think I think it's more of a now it's kind of hard because there's post grunge in the late 90s, which is, obviously more influenced by the Nirvana.
It wasn't near as like monumental or important or substantial as.
But I will counter you that, and like the Warped Tour TRL core that came in the next decade was completely inspired by Green Day. So like, to me though, they just deserve kind of. I know Kirk's a more mythological kind of figure, and he always
passing away.
Yeah, he always will be. But I think
in a different.
I think for importance, they deserve. They don't. Nirvana happened first. Nirvana set the stage.
Right.
but I do think they need to be discussed on very equal planks when you discuss 90s rock music. I think they
Well,
need to
that's
be
why I
talked
use the
about very
term.
similar.
That's why I use the term bridge. I think that there was a big gap there, and I think that it would never have been filled without Nirvana. But I think that Green Day obviously did its own thing. I think Green Day and Nirvana are very different. I think they
Mhm.
spawned different whatever copycat bands, and they have a different what's the word I'm looking for here? Like the legend of those bands is very different.
No,
So
yeah, they are. And I will say, to tie back to stuff you and I talk about more often, is the other two bands then that sort of fall off of that we always talk about is Op Ivy and Bad Religion, because they are
right,
those are the connective tissue between the end of hardcore punk in like the 80s sort of California punk that we were talking about for a couple
yeah,
of weeks, like Circle Jerks and all that. It's Bad Religion and
right,
Operation Ivy, which really that gets the sound going to help the Gilman thing for then Green Day to emerge out of that. So that is also that other part. That's the undergirding of that at the bottom. I think that's always important to note, that there was still a path that Green Day had to get there. And I think very much the scene set up by Operation Ivy and the sound set up by Bad Religion really helped foster that as a template of where to go.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. It's not often that we have a lot of things that we just flat out agree on.
Yeah. Jeez.
Let's discuss the blend of styles that give us the original Green Day sound, because they have changed a little bit over the years.
Mhm.
But there's a sound that Green Day has. Okay, and what I wrote down was, I hear, and we talked about this earlier, and I said we are going to touch on it again, and now is the time, because I want to talk about some of their. They have this like blend of sounds. I hear equal parts pop from songs like Pulling Teeth, and then punk rock with songs like Welcome to Paradise and Basket Case, right? So that those two songs are very much punk rock songs, maybe not vocally, but musically they really are. And Pulling Teeth is very poppy, and then you get a healthy dash of like early hardcore punk. With some of their faster songs and like guitar riffs specifically. Again, maybe not vocally, but with their music for sure. In the End is a song that I would say has a lot of hardcore influences with the guitar riffs and stuff. But it's clear that they loved stuff like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. They also loved bands like the Beatles, and probably many, many other bands that fall into that category as well. But they come from the Gilman scene. So there's going to be stuff like Op Ivy, Jawbreaker, The Offspring, Filth. That's all going to be heard throughout Green Day's early music, but there's a blend that comes together to form the formula of early Green Day, and I think it's like probably 40% like pop, 40% punk rock, and then like a 20% other. And that would include some hardcore punk influences, some almost some emo shoegaze.
What they
stuff,
top it off with, yeah,
right.
yeah. I mean, I think that's actually the formulation. My calculation here is 72%. No, I'm just kidding.
Right.
But yeah, that's really what it is. They're that's why they sort of remind me of that Ramones formula in a way, in that it is sort of like, I don't think they sat down necessarily to make punk songs. I think they sat down to kind of make rock songs, but their style, their scene, the way they sort of approach music was, they were going to play power chords. They were going to play it fast. The songs weren't going to be long. The lyrics weren't going to be super serious. So I think they put their personality to trying to like kind of do those things. And I think it's basically what you're saying with that, like kind of 40 and 40. And then there's all that other stuff. And like I have Longview. I have in my notes for Longview. I was like, Longview is like a pop, almost like Disney version of like an early 80s like punk rock song that would be really long and jammy and would have these fast parts and slow parts. Like, I think it's something that would be really grimy at like the Whiskey a Go-Go in like 1983. You could like reverse engineer Longview to kind of sound like that with this long bass line. More of that, a lot of those bands were bringing in like that jam band rock music influence. Same thing with the End of Chump. Like that's something that would have been, I think, in like the early 80s scene. But then there's songs like Welcome to Paradise, which is literally from their Gilman era, just sort of altered. And then I have In the End and FOD, which like those are just precursors, which again, precursors to the later punk that they would kind of influence, which we always talk about. That is the combination of like the early pop punk stuff with these hardcore elements that as those stuff emerged, combined with like the Ramones style stuff. And they have that on here as well. So they have a nice representation of a lot of different elements of different types of music. But a lot of them still have like a very punk or alternative feel to them. They just stack them on top of each other really, really nice. But because they always have that pop pop sensibility, it kind of doesn't matter what else they put on it, because that pop sensibility that they have is always kind of the Green Day sound, and like the punk guitar that is part of it. Even when it's an acoustic guitar, it still kind of sounds like punk guitar with Green Day. It's kind of weird.
Well, I think that one of the things a lot of people, okay, so like punk rockers are interesting people, and I would include myself in this conversation here, because sometimes I want a song or a band or an album or whatever that is just straight up punk, dude. I want it to be fast. I don't want no slow crap. I don't need a lot of intricate guitar work. But then you'll have people like, when you talk about bands like Green Day, you won't. Okay, it even happened when we talked about NoFX The Decline. People are like, well, you don't know anything about music because they did this, and this, and it's like, okay, man, that's musical snobbery, and that's okay. There's a place for that. There's a place for that even in punk rock. But I think at the very core, that's what I love about punk rock, is the absence of that stuff. I like stripped down basic songs, but I think with bands like Green Day, like you said, they never really intended to be a punk band. They weren't wearing mohawks. They didn't have, like, they weren't Rancid. Like, Rancid was basically, if you had Green Day that intended to be a punk band, I think you would have another Rancid. I mean, hell, he wrote half a Radio, like one of Rancid's best songs ever.
He was invited to join the band before Lars.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
like, so I do think if that's what they intended to do, so calling them not punk probably doesn't bother them, and it shouldn't bother their fans either. So there's going to be some fans of theirs that are going to be like, no, man, they're definitely da-da-da-da-da. Okay, that's fine. You can call them whatever you want. I have said many, many times on this channel and on this podcast that all these things are very much up to interpretation. Like, you can think whatever you want. I don't care. Like, if you call them the most punk band, that's fine. I would disagree with that, but I don't care. And if you call them not a punk band, there's arguments for both of those. So, like, I mean, you can definitely call them very punk rock based on the fact that they got as big as they did by kind of doing what they wanted. But there will be people that argue that they didn't do that. And I'm like, what are you talking about?
So they have a few things. They always claim that they've never really made the musical compromise, and they say because they work with Rob Cavallo, that they just like they're pretty much, they sold so much with Dookie that they never have really had to do what like a label says or do any kind of stuff like that. And I kind of believe them to an extent, although I do think they want to do stuff every now and then just to sell records because they do have that opportunity. Like, and they want to explore these things. So like, but to me, that's what selling out and all that stuff would be, is if you just constantly change based on what you want to do. Like, Green Day's had misses, and they wouldn't have had those misses if they listened to everyone within the music industry. But also, like, one thing with them is, even within the, maybe they're not like street punks, but they are never not getting themselves into trouble, even into their late 30s and early 40s.
Yeah, but I don't think that has any correlation with punk rock, dude. Like,
no,
I don't
think
those things go together personally.
I do, because it means that they still don't have the best literacy in interacting with the mainstream for a band that is so damn big. Like, I still think,
I can see that.
You know what I mean? I still think if they were just a more normal band at their core, like, they wouldn't have had like some of these things that have been infamous or famous or this.
That's true.
I think their roots and again, or maybe it's like what the guy said in the Offspring book whenever he said the Offspring weren't punks, but they made punk songs, whereas Green Day were punks. They just made a different type of music. And I think maybe that's the thing too, is like again, that authenticity. Like, I just. You cannot like what Green Day does, and Green Day is very straight up about the things that they do too. And like you said, they're never crying to be punk or be thought of as punk. Although they did not like their ouster from the Gilman scene, but they also, how many fundraisers have they done over the years to keep Gilman Street alive to this day and that kind of stuff. So it's a weird conversation. It was much weirder back in the day, though. That stuff from like 1994, when people were protesting outside of their shows and stuff like that. Like, that was crazy. That was kind of extreme. Well, like, no, I don't think anyone faced that sort of backlash more so than Green Day. Like, they went through it. They took it on the nose, like unbelievable. Like, there's a whole issue of Maximum Rock and Roll that's just dedicated to smearing Green Day for signing to a major. And it's like, you know, Tim Johannen's comparing what they did to the Nazi takeover of Germany. Like, it is insane the level that vitriol that kind of got thrown their way, for a band that was like didn't really ask for it in that sort of way. Like like you said, they weren't posers. They weren't claiming to be something that they weren't. They were just always doing their thing. They just happened to come from this scene, and people recognize, oh, that sounds like punk rock. That's what that is, and so they're getting labeled that way. But it was irrational. It was too much. Like it's kind of crazy that people even ever thought like that. Like as passionate as this conversation can get versus how people were talking about it in the 90s is like, that's wild. And I think they really are the template for the gatekeeping band. Like all these conversations, not that didn't always exist before, but kind of because punk was always so low before that in the 80s. Just signing to a major was that you had made it big. It didn't matter that you actually made it on the major because bands would sign in the 80s. They're the band that signed to the major and actually freaking made it. So that was the real difference between them and all these other bands like, Circle Jerks that had signed to a major and this and that, which caught a little bit of flack, but not to the level of protests outside of their shows, as if, they were killing babies in there or something.
I have two things I want to respond to, then we'll move on to my next topic, and then we'll move on to the next album. So one was, as you were saying that, okay, shoot, I don't want to forget. Okay, so one is that they sometimes they wrote songs to be hits, right? Mm-hmm. They just wrote a song to try to make a hit. I don't understand the problem with that. I don't understand why punk bands can't do that. Like I just don't get it. There's nothing inherently un-punk rock about making a song that's good that people like. Outside the fact that maybe I would say that punk rock is just by nature a subculture, not a culture. So that being the case, I say that there's a little bit, but if you write a song that's great, you can't really help it if people like it. Mm-hmm. I don't think that you have to make a song sound like shit just to be punk rock, and I think a lot of people would disagree with that. And I just don't understand that.
Yeah. And, no, I'm a total agreement with all of that because, and I think the only thing about the hit is like, are you making a kind of music that you don't want to be making to sell the record? Like that is to me a big distinction between making something is going to appeal to a lot of people or you think is really good or you're putting the time and effort and care into. Like to me, that's like all of our great bands really did that. Like they're. Then all these bands are sellouts because even like some crappy punk rock that you've heard, a lot of effort was put into that, a lot of craft and a lot of appeal. There's a reason why we're still hearing the Minor Threat songs stuff 40 years ago. Like we're still hearing that because they resonated and were good songs. You know what I mean? It's just again like I understand it if like, oh, I don't want to do that because then that sounds like you are being a commodity and you are selling that thing and you're giving in to the man. And again, like there's never been an indication that Green Day's actually even ever done that. Like to the extent they've wrote hits is because they've got hits. That's what I was
gonna say.
They've got hits. Again, like their big pop song, "Time of Your Life," they came to it in this session. They came to it at the Dookie sessions. Rob Cavallo, the guy, thought it didn't really fit on the album. He turned out he was right, and it was a really big song a couple of years later. So I think they just sort of brought these songs to the table because again they've had it at every level. And again, like there's nothing wrong with writing Time Bomb or Ruby Soho. And yes, those songs were catchier, so they caught on. But you're gonna have unless you're one of those bands, like you said, that everything is at that specific BPM and every song is exactly like that. And there's great albums like that, and sometimes you want to listen to that album. But then to suggest any variance from that is like selling out or this and that, then it's like that would be very boring very quick if every band sounded just like that.
I've never got the impression that Green Day did anything that they didn't want to do. I've never got the impression that they were pushed into a direction that they ultimately went that they weren't entirely behind. I just can't imagine because I just don't feel like that's who they are by nature. So
they're also their level of success would mean that they would never have to either.
Well, it did after Dookie. Sure. Yeah. Okay,
you know what I mean? I know, but
the machine has to get oiled. It has to have gas fed to it. So, I mean, they might be told to, hey man, look, you got a warning. Warning wasn't as, gravitated towards or successful as say Dookie and Insomniac. So we need you guys to come in and write something. I just can't imagine that they were like, okay. I would be shocked.
I feel like because both of the amount of money they have and their attitudes, they'd be like, well, screw you. We're not going to do that. We'll just retire,
You also mentioned that they were given a lot of flack by specifically Maximum Rock and Roll,
Mm-hmm.
for signing to a label and whatever, but they were never really welcomed in that scene anyway. So like, what did they care? But
Tim Yohannan rejected Sweet Children's first demo and said
that's my point.
They couldn't play at Gilman and he was wrong about that too, because then they got on just because their drummer had to sort of like finagle their way in a few months later, and that Gilman crowd loved it. By the way, the Gilman crowd was because they sounded like Gilman Street. He was the one who was out of touch actually is what was going on there.
That's kind of my point, and I think that it makes me embarrassed as a punk rocker that people behave that way. That you have these pretentious, self-important people, that those are usually the quote-unquote most punk rock people, and I think those are the ones that I have the least amount of desire to like be around and associate with. I don't want my channel, label, or record store being known as a place where those people congregate and run things, because I think that's disgusting, man. This totally goes against what I personally think punk rock is all about. I don't think you should be pushing people away. I think you should be bringing people in of all kinds, shapes, colors, musical styles to a degree even. I mean, listen to some of the stuff I'm listening to now. There's a band called Homefront, and they've got like post-punk Cure keyboard stuff in there, like Oi music, and it's amazing. Like, it's just, that band would have been ridiculed 30 years ago. They've been laughed at, and it's crazy because those dudes would probably kick the shit out of you. So like, you know what I'm saying? It's just so juvenile and stupid, which there's a degree of that just in punk rock by nature as well. So, I mean, I guess it's kind of finding the right mixture of all of it to make your stuff stay true to what it's supposed to be, but also be welcoming to others,
Yeah, and I get it. Like, I get it. The position of Gilman Street specifically, I get it to an extent. Like, I don't like the whole reason why the major label ban happened at Gilman Street was because of Dookie. Because, like, wait a minute, one of our house bands is one. Like, they never really had to worry about it as much before, so it didn't matter. Maybe if a band that was on a major that was a punk band came through, it wasn't that much of a consideration for them. I get it though from the perspective of like the club was suddenly overrun as a sort of tourist attraction, and that was really freaking annoying. So I do get that. Like that, but that's one venue in one instance.
Did they not know that was temporary? Like, come on. Like, I wasn't even there, and that's temporary. And not only that, but it helps. Like, we have to get over this whole, I want to be so punk and poor. Like, stop, dude. It helps everything. I was told the other day that, what band was it? It was like a death metal band. Was more, Scum was the album. Napalm Death was more culturally relevant to punk rock than Offspring Smash. Like, are you kidding me? Like, because these people are so into being punk and underground that they can't accept the fact that there is a trickle-down effect when something is successful. Now, whether or not you like that successful thing is irrelevant. You do benefit from its success. Excuse me. This fucking muscle, dude.
Jeez.
From this, when Green Day gets, the size of the Beatles, then a band that never would have even existed is formed. And that might be a crust punk band, but there is a way that you can get from that to that, and it makes sense. Stop, dude. Some kid that's listening to MGK right now at 12 years old, at age 16, might write a D-Beat record. Like, there's no telling, dude. Like, I don't know, man. I don't understand how these kids are so punked that they can't understand that. Like, capitalism is definitely overall a pretty disgusting thing, right? But it's kind of a necessary evil. Also, if that goes away, what are we going to fight against?
But
like,
don't pretend the indies aren't also participating in that too. That's always my thing to that too. Like, and that's always that's what Davey Havoc will say. That's what a lot of these guys say. It's not like all these like Brett has a pretty good reputation, but for the most part, they say it's not like all these indie labels are just the most virtuous places in the world. It's still the man. It's still the owners versus the workers. Like that is still a thing. I mean, I would still kind of trust maybe like an indie label just a little bit more, maybe not even that, but it's just the motivation's a little bit different. You know what I mean? Like, if you tell me you're going to do something, I know you're probably going to do it versus you looking at that spreadsheet tomorrow and be like, I'm actually not going to do that because of this. So there is that, but it's all business in the end.
That's how I operate 31 Records, dude. I mean, I just signed 3 bands, and one of those bands I signed a little while back, and they're not as big as one of the other bands that I just got the opportunity to work with. And so some people might go, oh, well, I'm not going to do this for them now because I have to worry about these guys. No. Dude, word is bond, my friend. So I told you I was going to do this. We're going to do this. Not to mention, I just love this music. So, like, I just want to work with everybody if I get the opportunity to, right? But I don't know, man. It's interesting. So before we move on to the split, I just want to talk about one last thing. This is the most fun part of this conversation.
All right.
What are the best songs off of Dookie, and what are the songs that you still listen to this day? Like, what are the ones that hold up to you? And this is just a subjective conversation more so than anything.
Okay, so let me pull up the track listing here.
Right.
So I have it up. Okay, so I love the way the album starts with Burnout. To me, that's like the intro thesis to the album and kind of to Green Day as like those sort of slacker anthems. Like, I'm not growing up, I'm just burning out. I think that perfectly summarizes what we're about to hit on the record. So I think that one,
you're not wrong,
has always kind of stayed with me. Obviously, Longview, Welcome to Paradise. We've heard them so much, so they're very much imprinted just on all of it. But those two specifically of the hits are the two that I really care for, and I like just where they are on the album. After that, again, all that stuff in the middle is good. Pulling Teeth is good. That back part of the album where it's like when the hits kind of go away, because it's a lot of hits between tracks 4 through 10. All 5 hits are kind of stuffed in there. So most of those songs are kind of the songs And then you go to Coming Clean, which is a pretty cool song, about his sexuality and about other people coming out of the closet. Coming Clean, Enemas Sleep Us, In the End, and FOD. I just think are an amazing, almost like little EP in and of itself of how good those songs are. So I tend to kind of go around the hits just because I've heard them so often. So I like to kind of start up I like to start at Burnout. I'll check in usually with Sassafras Roots. And then I go to Coming Clean all the way to the end. And just because I think that's more out of necessity of just having, it's not like I don't listen to She, Basket Case, Welcome to Paradise on a very regular basis because the videos will come on all the time. They're just kind of always on. But when I'm in the mood for some early Green Day, that's sort of the route I take. I'm looking at the track list and what's kind of the route I take. And that's
so you're like a B-side guy. Like you want to crack open B-sides.
The B-sides and then the first song. Because I just the way it starts with Burnout, I think is just like a perfect way to like when they did, I seen some of the videos when they did this live in full a couple of months ago in Vegas, and it was just perfect the way that kind of just opened everything. It's such a tone setter. I believe they play Burnout at almost every single show. It's one of the non-hits that gets played at almost all the shows because it's such an important song to them. Yeah, Coming Clean in those ones too. They also have that sort of ballady kind of feel to them too, which I do like Green Day when they're a little bit slow. I think like they're great at the fast stuff, obviously, but there's so much of it and so much of the other stuff that we listen to. I think some of their strength is in their slower stuff.
Dude, they don't have a lot of fast stuff, dude. You're wrong about that. They got a lot of mid-tempo stuff. They don't have a lot of fast stuff because all the fast stuff is my favorite stuff, and they don't have a lot of it.
But so contrasting that to their more ballady stuff, I would say I kind of like Green Day for their more ballady stuff.
I do like their ballads though. I'm not saying that that's wrong or anything. I think the bulk of their catalog is like a mid-tempo. But they have a small amount of the really fast stuff and a small amount of the ballad stuff. And honestly, I think you're right. I think that those bookends are probably my personal favorite stuff.
Yeah,
honestly.
and it's when Green Day's kind of going at those extremes, they're really good because they're such good musicians that they can do these extremes so well, and it still sounds so very like natural. And that's the really thing. Their sound like it doesn't sound like they're ever struggling to make these songs at all. They're not above their pay grade. If anything, they're just kind of showcasing a little bit of what they have, which is kind of crazy they were able to do that even back then to just be these great musicians without necessarily a ton of training in theory, just sort of this instinctive know-how and this the fandom they had of like rock music. I think again really just helped informed a lot of what they were putting out there. Their palette wasn't just limited just to the punk stuff. They really listened to it all, talked about it all, and incorporated a lot of that into their music.
Well, I also have about an EP's worth of stuff that I have literally check marked on here. And so my 6 songs that I really, really mess with on this album, because honestly, dude, the hits outside of Basket Case, for whatever reason, I just love that song. Mm-hmm. But like, man, I don't know, dude. Longview and Welcome to Paradise, I actively dislike those songs. Like, I just don't care about them. Like, will I bob my head if they come on? If they're on in a Best Buy, will I sing along to it? Of course, I can't help it. I'm 42. But those aren't the songs that I go to listen to. I have Having a Blast, Pulling Teeth, Basket Case, She, When I Come Around, and In the End are my like favorite songs on the album. Mm-hmm. And I started getting into Sassafras Roots like lately. I really like that song too. So that would make 7. But She is probably my favorite song on the whole album, which I found interesting that you didn't care for it as much.
Yeah.
It just goes to show you, man, like, you know, subjective opinion can be massively different while we both respect an album, you know?
I would still rate the song itself very high. There's nothing on here that I rate really low. You know, I think
that's actually a good point.
Overall, it's a pretty high quality album. Like, I don't know if there's anything that, I mean, there's stuff I'm not in the mood for all the time, but anything that's just like, oh
right.
God, I'm not going to hear that. Maybe the hidden track, you know what I mean? But the hidden track back in the day wasn't that big of a deal. Nowadays it comes up on Spotify right there. So it makes you
think it's that song so much.
It's like on there.
It's so dumb.
But it was, again, it was cool back because the CD would go and go and go. And maybe you were under the influence, maybe you weren't, and then that thing would pop back on and it would get you.
That did happen from time to time, but no, I never really liked that song. Never, even back in the '90s.
There's one weird. There's like a weird. It's like Trey Cool's like the Hefe, where he gets one weird song,
right?
Every album.
Actually, it's a good parallel. So I think that the album overall is high quality. I think that, like you said, it's saturated in just wonderful guitar playing, poppy hooks, and beautiful melody. And I don't know. I think that the album, I don't know why I was hating on it for a while. I do think it comes from memories that it will bring forward in my head. I had a rough time when this album came out in my life. So there's part of that, just like with the Offspring stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But this particular listen through, or this week, I did listen to it a few times. But there's a new rejuvenated respect for the record. I would say subjectively, it's probably going to hover around at 8 for me anyways, just because it is good, but I don't absolutely freak out about it. But objectively, I think it's probably like a 9.5 or higher. Like, it's really, really as perfect as you can get for an album like this, in my opinion.
Yeah, for me, it's like, it's always just pretty good. Like, if it's like I always tell you, I don't have it on vinyl. My daughter's got it on vinyl. She doesn't really listen to it much, but it's always just kind of good to put on. It's not
right.
a bad one too. If I'm shuffling through and like, I kind of don't want to listen to music, but I want to have something on. Dookie's kind of a good one because I know the songs well enough, but it's unobjectable enough. Like, I'm not going to have like some deep, really emotional outburst maybe during like a long, drawn out part, but it's still fun. You can sing along. It's good background music, but it's still good music in and of itself. It's just, as you said, like, quality. And then, I'm glad we talked about it in proximity to Smash, because they really are sort of sister albums in that way. They sort of, we talked about what was more important, this and that, but really they are two sides of this coin of 1994, which, included Jawbreaker and Rancid and NoFX and Pennywise and all that too. But these are the supernovas that
100%. That's a great descriptive word. Those are the supernovas, the champagne supernovas.